The feeling of moral inferiority does not arise from a collision with a generally accepted moral law, but from a conflict with the self, which, for the sake of psychic balance, demands that the deficit be compensated. You probably felt it, that strange heaviness of staying when every part you wanted to go. You stayed not because it was still love or hope, but because leaving felt like betrayal. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that good people don't walk away. That love means endurance. That strength is silence. That sacrifice somehow equals virtue. But what if that belief, that endless endurance, is what's been breaking you piece by piece? What if the guilt that keeps you loyal is really the mask that fear wears to keep you small? Carl Jung once wrote that every symptom is an attempt by the soul to restore balance. Think about that for a moment. Maybe the anxiety that tightens your chest isn't random. Maybe the exhaustion that lingers no matter how long you sleep, or that quiet emptiness you carry through your days, isn't a failure of your mind, but a form of communication. The psyche speaks through discomfort when words are ignored. What you call burnout might actually be rebellion. What you name sadness might be your soul's first attempt to move toward truth. We've been conditioned to confuse empathy with self-erasure, to think that kindness means accepting everything, forgiving everything, and enduring everything. We were taught to hold on, no matter how heavy it becomes, to prove our worth. But the soul doesn't measure love by how much pain you can bear. It measures it by how truthfully you can live. Staying where you no longer grow isn't loyalty. It's quiet self-abandonment. And each time you silence your own needs for someone else's comfort, a piece of your inner world dims a little more. You can see it in small ways. The way your laughter sounds softer now. The way your body tenses at the sound of their voice. The way you stop sharing your dreams because you already know they'll be dismissed. You tell yourself this is maturity, compromise, patience, but deep down, you know it's erosion. Jung warned that when consciousness distances itself too far from the unconscious, it collapses. That collapse doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like numbness. Sometimes it looks like a polite smile that hides a dying light. And so, guilt becomes a chain that binds you. Guilt for wanting peace. Guilt for not being who they need. Guilt for even thinking of leaving. But guilt is not morality. It's the shadow side of empathy. The part that keeps you serving others long after you've stopped serving yourself. There's nothing noble in staying where your soul withers. There's only the slow disconnection from who you were meant to be. You see, the world often praises endurance, but rarely honors alignment. It tells you to forgive endlessly, to give endlessly, to stay endlessly, even when the staying kills you softly. Yet there is a moment, quiet but unmistakable, when staying becomes a deeper betrayal than leaving ever could. When your spirit starts to shrink just to fit the room you've outgrown. When your smile becomes armor and every "I'm fine" is another little funeral for your truth. The question is not, what happens if you go? The real question is, what happens if you don't? Because there's a point when the soul stops whispering and begins to cry out, not for escape, but for wholeness. It begins to push, to ache, to create tension so strong that the illusion of peace finally breaks. That's not weakness. That's resurrection. And when that moment comes, when the silence of your soul turns into a sacred demand for freedom, you will finally understand. Leaving was never betrayal. It was obedience. Obedience to the quiet voice of God within you that has been saying all along, you were never meant to stay where you stopped being alive. Jung once said that the unconscious doesn't destroy what's false. It simply tries to restore balance. It doesn't punish. It corrects. And when you keep forcing yourself to stay in something your soul has already outgrown, that quiet internal order begins to fracture. The symptoms come first, subtle at the beginning. A heavy tiredness that no rest seems to fix, a faint bitterness that seeps into your words, the way your body feels heavier each morning. Then come the restless nights, the unease, the resentment. These are not random misfortunes. They are the language of the psyche saying, you've already completed your task here. But the rational mind, ruled by habit and fear, negotiates endlessly. Maybe I just need more time. Maybe I can change. Maybe if I love harder, it will work. That's not intuition speaking. That's the ego trying to bargain with nature. The ego believes it can outthink divine timing. as if the cycles of the psyche were contracts it could rewrite. Yet everything in nature has its rhythm: birth, growth, decay, renewal. The tree does not cling to its leaves when autumn arrives. It lets them go, trusting that spring will return. Why do we resist what every living thing accepts as sacred order? The truth is, the soul has its own seasons too. When something inside you begins to feel stale, when joy feels like a memory and presence turns into performance, it's usually not because you're lazy or broken. It's because the inner season has shifted. What once nourished you now begins to confine you. Jung wrote that the soul becomes sick when denied the possibility of transformation. And that sickness often appears as anxiety, irritability, loss of meaning, signs not a failure, but a transition. Yet we feel guilty for following that natural movement. We call it selfish to choose peace over obligation, to step away from what drains us. But that guilt belongs to the ego, the part of you that believes your worth depends on being indispensable. It fears irrelevance more than it loves truth. Individuation, the process Jung called the path to wholeness, demands the opposite. It asks for surrender. It asks you to release what no longer serves your becoming, even if that makes you appear cold, distant, or ungrateful in the eyes of others. Because true love doesn't bind, it liberates. It's not the kind that says, "Stay so I can feel safe." It's the kind that whispers, "Go, if your soul needs to grow." Real connection honors transformation, even when it means walking separate paths. It trusts that what is aligned with truth will return in a higher form, and what isn't will dissolve gracefully. Still, life complicates this wisdom. The person still calls. The job still pays. The family still expects. The story you've been living still pleads for one more chapter. So you stay half present, half gone, trying to serve both truth and fear, wondering why peace keeps slipping away. But here's what Jung understood deeply. When the unconscious begins to push you forward and consciousness resists, tension builds between the two. That tension is a birthplace of change, but if ignored, it becomes suffering. And maybe that's where you are now, standing in that invisible tug-of-war between what is dying and what wants to be born. The unconscious has already packed its bags. The ego still clings to the past, insisting it can fix what's already complete. But sooner or later, one truth will become impossible to silence. You cannot heal in the same place that keeps you broken. And when that moment comes, you'll realize the pull you've been calling anxiety was never your enemy. It was your soul trying to set you free. This is when the most painful tension of the soul begins. The space between what you feel and what you think you should feel. It's not an external war, but an invisible one unfolding beneath the surface of your everyday life. One part of you whispers, "It's over." Another insists, "You can't go." And caught in between, your nervous system becomes a battlefield. You smile while something inside you trembles. You tell yourself you're fine, while your body quietly starts to unravel. That's not weakness. It's a psychological collision between truth and conditioning. Jung called this the conflict of opposites, the point where the unconscious begins to compensate for the ego's stubborn one-sidedness. When consciousness clings too tightly to one direction, the unconscious pulls in the other, not to destroy but to restore balance. The more the ego insists on control, the louder the body speaks in the language of symptoms: anxiety, insomnia, irritability, numbness. What looks like emotional instability is often just the psyche's attempt to heal itself. You might think you're breaking down, but in reality, you're breaking open. The pain you feel is not random. It's friction, the heat generated by transformation. Every sigh, every sleepless night, every sudden wave of anger that has no clear target is your inner world pushing against the cage of what's familiar. The mind says stay calm, the soul says move. One seeks safety, the other seeks truth. And until you honor both, the tension will only deepen. This is a moment where most people get lost, in the confusion between the desire to change and the fear of what that change will cost. We try to fix the conflict with logic, routines, and plans. But the unconscious doesn't speak the language of control. It speaks through symbols, through dreams, through feelings that refuse to be reasoned away. It's not trying to punish you for wanting peace. It's trying to guide you toward a version of peace that's actually real. Jung described a resolution to this inner war as a transcendent function, the natural process that unites the opposing forces of the psyche. He wrote, "The tendency of the unconscious and that of the consciousness are the two factors that form the transcendent function. It makes possible the passage from one attitude to another. That passage isn't about escape or surrender. It's about integration. It's the sacred middle path that allows something new to be born, not a compromise, but a transformation. To reach it, however, something in you has to yield. The ego must loosen its grip on being right, on being good, on being in control. It has to die a little, to make space for a truer life to emerge. And that dying, that small internal death, is what we often mistake for guilt, because letting go of an identity that once kept you safe feels like betrayal. The moment you stop performing the role you were praised for, the caregiver, the loyal one, the strong one, the mind screams, you're abandoning who you are. But you're not abandoning yourself. You're shedding what was never truly you. Still, it hurts, because every rebirth begins disguised as loss. The friendships that fade, the jobs that no longer fit, the relationships that dissolve, they don't end to punish you. They end to free the parts of you that can't breathe in those old shapes anymore. And if you can stay present in that space between endings and beginnings without rushing to fix the discomfort, something extraordinary happens. The tension that once tormented you becomes light. The energy that once drained you begins to move through you. That's the crossing Jung spoke of. The transformation that can't be forced, only allowed. Because every liberation, at first, feels like dying. But it isn't death you're meeting. It's life finally taking its rightful place within you. When you ignore the quiet call to leave, life begins to pull you out by force. It starts subtly, a heaviness you can't name, a growing sense of disconnection from the world you helped build. The things that once inspired you now feel dull. Conversations repeat themselves like scripts you've already memorized. The smiles you give start to tremble at the edges. You wake up tired, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying a life that no longer fits. Jung called this the inertia of the ego, the psychological weight that keeps us clinging to outdated patterns because the alternative, transformation, feels too uncertain. You see, the ego loves stability. It wants to maintain control, even if it means keeping you inside a version of yourself that no longer breathes. It's attached to structure, to predictability, to identity. But the unconscious, the deeper, wiser part of your being, moves differently. It's not bound by appearances. It seeks balance, authenticity, and wholeness. So when the ego insists on staying in a situation that's spiritually finished, the unconscious begins to rebel. It whispers through discomfort, "You're done here." Ignore that whisper long enough, and it will find another way to get your attention. Through insomnia, resentment, anxiety, a sudden illness, or the feeling that time itself has stopped flowing. It's not the world punishing you. It's life trying to correct your direction. Jung wrote that the psyche will always attempt to restore equilibrium, even if that process feels catastrophic to the ego. And that's exactly what happens when you stay beyond your time. Relationships become prisons disguised as loyalty. The job that once gave you purpose becomes a slow suffocation. Every day feels heavier, slower, emptier, like living inside a contract you didn't remember signing. You start to confuse numbness with peace, because at least numbness doesn't hurt as much. But beneath that numbness, yourself, the eternal center of your being, is pounding at the walls, begging to be heard. When the soul aches, it's not asking for punishment. It's asking for truth. And truth, by nature, disrupts comfort. The guilt you feel about wanting to leave isn't proof that you're wrong. It's proof that the persona, the mask you've been wearing to be accepted, is beginning to crack. The persona pleads, "Stay, or they'll stop loving you." It's terrified of becoming invisible. But the self, that quiet inner authority, whispers, "Go, and you'll finally see who you are." And this tug-of-war between mask and essence is what tears people apart from inside. We lose ourselves trying to save images. The image of being a good partner, the perfect employee, the dependable friend. We tell ourselves that sacrifice is virtue. But sacrifice, without meaning, is slow self-abandonment. It's the attempt to keep the old life alive after the spirit has already left it. That's why staying too long always costs more than leaving ever could. Because the longer you ignore your truth, the louder life must become to wake you up. Then one day, something inside snaps. Not violently, more like a quiet collapse. You realize you're no longer willing to argue with your intuition. The exhaustion turns into clarity. You stop rehearsing explanations in your head. Stop trying to justify your sadness. Stop apologizing for wanting something real. That's the sacred turning point Jung often hinted at. When suffering transforms into insight, the same pain that once crushed you now becomes a doorway to consciousness. And in that stillness, you begin to understand you don't have to destroy the past to move on from it. You just have to stop pretending it's still your present. Leaving is a rejection. It's alignment. It's honoring the life that's calling from beyond what you've known. It's letting your truth breathe without asking for permission. This is where the art of walking away with peace begins. Not from anger, not from pride, but from reverence. Reverence for your own evolution. Because peace isn't always soft or serene. Sometimes peace looks like a slow, deliberate departure. Sometimes peace is a closed door that doesn't need to slam. And that's when you finally realize letting go was never the loss. The real loss was every moment you spent betraying your own soul to keep something that had already let you go. Learning to walk away without guilt is not emotional detachment. It's a sacred act of alignment. It's the moment you realize that love without freedom is not devotion, it's dependency. That kindness without boundaries is not virtue, it's slow self-erasure. Jung saw this movement, the quiet courage to leave what no longer serves the soul, as a crucial step in individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming whole. Individuation isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming real. It's the birth of the self through the shedding of false identities, the breaking away from collective expectations, and the reconciliation of opposites within you. Every transformation begins with a decision that feels impossible. To walk away not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started listening. To stop seeking permission to evolve. Jung described this process as a natural unfolding of the psyche, where the conscious and unconscious begin to cooperate instead of compete. It's not a moral act, but a spiritual necessity, because staying where your soul has finished its work means postponing your own becoming. The journey can be seen in 4 phases, each one both gentle and fierce in its demand for truth. Recognize, this is where everything begins to crack open. You stop romanticizing struggle and start telling yourself the truth. The cycle has ended. Recognition isn't intellectual, it's visceral. It's a knot in your stomach when you say, I'm fine, and no, you're not. It's the ache you can't explain away anymore. Jung wrote that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Recognition is the moment you stop calling suffering fate. Integrate. This is where guilt arrives, like an old friend you never want to see again. It whispers that you're selfish, ungrateful, heartless. But guilt isn't the enemy. It's a residue of old conditioning, proof that your boundaries are being rebuilt. To integrate is to make peace with paradox, to feel fear but move anyway, to grieve while choosing life. Every tear shed in this stage is a prayer for authenticity. Act consciously. Leaving doesn't have to look dramatic. It doesn't require explanations or burn bridges. You don't go because of anger. You go because clarity has made staying impossible. You act not to prove something, but to preserve your wholeness. The conscious exit is clean. It honors what was while refusing to betray what is. It's when you stop needing closure from others and start giving it to yourself. Be silent. This is the phase the ego hates most. The void after departure. The space where the old story is gone, but the new one hasn't yet begun. The instinct is to fill it, to find another person, another distraction, another mission. But silence is the womb of transformation. It's where meaning reorganizes itself. It's where the self, having reclaimed its voice, begins to breathe again. With each step, something incredible happens. The energy that was once wasted on pleasing, fixing, or explaining starts to return to you. The fog lifts. Your vitality comes back. The world feels both unfamiliar and alive again. You start to understand that departure isn't an end. It's a metamorphosis. It's how love evolves into a freer, truer form. Because love that demands your self-abandonment is not love. It's fear in disguise. To walk away with peace is not to reject the past. It's to bless it and release it. It's to look back without bitterness, to whisper, "Thank you," and to keep walking. The soul doesn't measure worth by how long you stay. It measures by how truthfully you move. But even on this path of awakening, the ego doesn't disappear. It adapts. It starts to wear the mask of spirituality, whispering, "Look how enlightened you are for letting go." And that's when the next challenge begins, when the shadow tries to sneak back in, disguised as wisdom. Because even the most awakened can stumble into the subtle traps of the ego dressed as consciousness. There are hidden traps along the path of awakening, subtle, seductive, and dangerously convincing. Jung warned that the moment we begin to grow in consciousness, the ego doesn't simply vanish. It adapts. It puts on new clothes, speaks in softer tones, and calls itself spiritual. And that's why, after you finally found the strength to walk away, the real work begins. Not in leaving, but in staying awake. The first trap is spiritual inflation, the quiet arrogance that whispers, "I've transcended this." It's the belief that walking away makes you wiser, higher, more evolved than those who still struggle. But inflation is just the ego disguised as enlightenment. Jung described it as a state in which the conscious mind identifies with the archetypal power of the self and mistakes expansion for superiority. It feels intoxicating, like clarity with a halo. But it separates you from humility, the very soil where true awareness grows. Leaving doesn't make you superior. It simply brings you back to zero, to the sacred humility of being who you really are without the need to prove it. The second trap is emotional isolation, mistaking solitude for purity. When you've been hurt or drained, it's tempting to build walls and call them boundaries. You start to believe that detachment is protection, and that distance equals strength. But individuation, as Jung taught, is not withdrawal from the world. It's presence without dependence. It's the ability to be among others without losing yourself, to feel deeply without drowning, to love without needing to possess. Isolation freezes what liberation was meant to free. True wholeness doesn't live in the mountains. It lives in the marketplace, in conversation, in connection. The third trap is a savior complex, wanting to leave so the other person will finally see, will finally change. You turn your departure into a lesson, a quiet performance of righteousness. But that, too, is control. That, too, is ego. Jung warned that whenever we project our transformation onto others, we lose our own center. To walk away as an act of teaching is still to bind yourself to the very story you meant to end. Freedom cannot be proven. It can only be lived. Overcoming these traps requires a gentler strength, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. It means letting silence replace justification, letting peace speak where words once defended. You stop explaining, stop comparing, stop performing the image of someone who has healed. You simply exist, and that existence radiates a quiet truth. Peace no longer needs witnesses. True detachment, then, isn't about escape. It's not a cold rejection of the world or a posture of superiority. It's stable consciousness, the ability to stand in the middle of life's contradictions without collapsing into them. It's knowing you can hold love and distance in the same breath. It's walking away without closing your heart. And when you reach this point, when humility replaces pride, when connection feels effortless, when your silence becomes a language of calm, something extraordinary unfolds. You realize the separation you feared was never real. The opposites that once tore you apart, love and freedom, giving and receiving, self and other, begin to merge. You understand what the ego never could. That the purpose of leaving was never to escape, but to return. Return to presence. Return to truth. Return to yourself. Because in the end, the art of walking away is not about distance. It's about alignment. It's not about who you left behind, but about who you finally met within. If this message spoke to your soul, comment below, "I choose my peace." And continue your journey of self-discovery and inner freedom by watching the next episode, where we'll explore how endings are not losses, but portals to the life your soul has been waiting for. This is where the paradox dissolves. The tension that once tore you apart begins to soften, and you finally see what all the pain was pointing toward. Walking away was never rejection. It was reverence. You didn't abandon anyone. You honored the truth of what had already ended. Every person, every place, every phase you had to leave behind wasn't a mistake. They were teachers of your soul. Each one brought you a lesson wrapped in attachment. Each one shaped you into the consciousness that now stands freer, quieter, more whole. You no longer carry resentment because you no longer need to. The guilt fades, not because you forgot, but because you understood. You understood that maturity in love isn't measured by how tightly you hold on, but by how gently you release. Love doesn't vanish when you let go. It changes form. It stops being something you chase and becomes something that moves through you. It breathes, it blesses, it allows. There's a stillness that follows this awareness, the kind that doesn't demand closure, because closure already lives within you. The past no longer needs to be rewritten. It simply rests in gratitude. You look back and no longer ask, why did this happen to me? But rather, what did this awaken in me? That question transforms endings into initiations. The same path that once felt like exile now feels sacred. Each step not a retreat, but a homecoming. This is the moment the soul finally exhales. The heaviness you carried turns into space. The silence that once terrified you becomes peace. You're no longer trying to prove your worth by staying, nor defending your decision to go. You've discovered a deeper rhythm, the freedom to remain open while moving forward. And in that rhythm, you realize that forgiveness was never about others. It was about yourself. The real forgiveness is not saying, I forgive you, but whispering, I release myself. You start to see that everything, even the heartbreaks, was an invitation back to wholeness. That the road you thought was leading you away was actually guiding you inward, to the center of your own being, to the place where love and freedom are no longer opposites, but one and the same. Jung wrote that the self is both the journey and the destination, the divine pattern within us that knows how to bring all opposites into unity. You feel that truth now, not as an idea, but as a quiet pulse inside your chest. The world around you doesn't change overnight, but your vision of it does. You can meet what once wounded you without bitterness. You can bless what once broke you without resistance. The ego fought to keep control, but the soul has learned to trust. You no longer need certainty, only presence. And that presence feels like peace, the kind that doesn't depend on outcomes, only on alignment. So you walk, not away, but toward simplicity, toward truth, toward the version of you that no longer begs to be seen. Because it finally is. You walk lighter now, because nothing owns you. You walk softer, because you've made peace with the parts of yourself you once ran from. You walk with open hands, because real love doesn't cling. It blesses as it passes through. And as the road stretches before you, you realize a great secret. You never truly left anything behind. You simply came home to the self that was waiting all along. Peace arrives when love learns to walk alone. If this video resonated with your soul, comment below, I choose to walk away in peace. And continue your journey of self-knowledge and inner freedom by watching the next episode, where we'll explore how every ending carries the seed of the beginning, and how the courage to release becomes the power to rise.